Gideon Strake didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Adeline Marlowe's office swung open hard enough to crack against the wall, and he walked in like a man who already considered the room his own. His boots tracked mud across the floor she'd had polished that morning. He dropped a folded document onto her desk without asking, then stood back with his thumbs hooked in his belt, wearing the particular smile he saved for moments when he believed he'd already won. "Sign it," he said, "before that flood takes everything you've got left and you're standing in the dirt begging." Adeline didn't touch the paper. "I haven't read it." "You don't need to read it. You need to survive the spring. Merge Silver Briar with my operation, and you walk away with your name on half of the biggest ranch in this valley." He leaned forward, one hand flat on her desk. "Or you can keep trusting that drifter you dragged in from the road and lose everything your father built." Outside the window, she could hear Wade Hollister directing her hands in the yard. His voice was calm, steady, the way it always was. Gideon followed her eyes, and his smile tightened into something uglier. "Sign it, Adeline. That man has nothing. He'll be gone by summer, and you'll have nothing either. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels, because what happens next at Silver Briar Ranch is something none of them saw coming. Stay with me until the very end." The morning Wade Hollister appeared at Silver Briar's gate, Adeline was already irritated. It wasn't the cold. Montana in early April still carried winter's stubbornness in the air, a bite that got into your hands and stayed there no matter how many layers you wore. It wasn't the season that had put the edge in her mood that morning. It was her foreman, Chet Dawes, who had spent the better part of breakfast listing every reason the ranch was understaffed and every reason he couldn't fill those positions with anyone worth hiring. "Good men don't come looking for work in April," Chet had said, forking a piece of salt pork with the same expression a man might use to describe a funeral. "Good men are already placed by February. Anybody showing up now is what got left over." Adeline had let him talk. She was good at that, letting men talk until they finished, then making her own decision anyway. It was a skill she'd developed early, running a ranch alone in a territory where half the men she dealt with still weren't entirely sure a woman had the right to do it. She'd been standing near the stable when she saw them. Two figures, one tall, one small, moving up the road from the main gate on foot, which already told her something. A man with a horse didn't walk it all the way to the door unless the horse was in worse shape than he was. The tall one had a worn saddlebag hanging over one shoulder. He moved like someone who'd been moving a long time, not slow exactly, but deliberate, like a man who'd learned not to waste steps because he couldn't afford to. The small one was a boy. Maybe 8 years old, she thought. Maybe younger. It was hard to tell because he was bundled so heavily for the cold that only his face showed, and his face had that particular look children get when they've been outside too long and they're trying hard not to complain about it. Chet appeared at her shoulder. He'd seen them too. "I'll send them off," he said. He had his foreman voice on the one that was professional enough to not be openly rude, but firm enough to make the point. "Wait," Adeline said. She watched the man and the boy cross the yard. The boy stayed a half step behind his father, matching his pace with the kind of quiet obedience that came not from fear but from trust. Like he believed his father knew exactly where they were going, even if he didn't. The man stopped a respectful distance from where she stood. He took off his hat. He was older than she'd first guessed. Early 40s, maybe. The kind of face that had seen weather in both senses of the word actual weather, and the other kind, the sort that came from years of difficulty stacking up like unpaid debts. His jaw was rough with several days of growth, and his coat was decent enough but worn thin at the elbows. He held his hat with both hands. She noticed his left hand briefly, a pale scar across the palm, old and fully healed, the kind that came from something sharp. "I heard you're short-handed," he said. His voice was level. "No performance in it. I'm looking for work. Any kind. I don't have conditions." "What's your name?" Adeline asked. "Wade Hollister." She looked at the boy. "That's Jamie," Wade said. "He's mine. He won't be any trouble. How old is he?" 8. He paused. "He'll be 9 in June." Adeline looked back at Wade. "Where are you coming from?" "East of Billings, most recently. Before that, the Crawford operation over in Garfield County." "Why'd you leave Crawford's?" Drought took his herd by 2/3. He couldn't afford the hands he had. He kept the ones with seniority. No bitterness in how he said it. Just the fact of it, flat and plain. And your family, wife? Something moved across Wade's face, brief. He didn't look away, which she respected. She passed. 4 years ago. Adeline said nothing for a moment. Chet stepped up beside her. We're not set up to take on family situations, he said, directing it mostly at Wade. The bunkhouse is working men. No accommodations for. I'm not asking for accommodations, Wade said. He wasn't rude about it. He didn't raise his voice, but he addressed it directly and clearly, which made Chet stop. Give me the hardest job you've got, whatever nobody else wants. I'll sleep wherever there's space. Just let my boy sleep somewhere warm. The last sentence landed differently than the rest. Not because he's meant it to Adeline, didn't think this was a man who calculated his words for effect. That was what made it land. She looked at the boy again. Jamie was watching her with the careful attention of a child who understood that the grown-ups were deciding something important and who had learned not to say anything that might make it go the wrong way. 30 days, Adeline said. We'll see what you can do. Chet made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She ignored it. Wade put his hat back on. Yes, ma'am, that's fair. Chet will show you where to put your things. There's a small room off the end of the stable. It's got a stove that works most of the time. It'll be warmer than out here. She looked at Jamie. Supper's at 6. You're both welcome to eat in the kitchen. She walked away before Chet could argue. The decision was already made. She'd learned a long time ago that the moment you started explaining yourself, you started losing ground. What she didn't examine, at least not then, was why she'd said yes at all. There was something about the way Wade Hollister stood in her yard. Not desperate, even though he clearly was. Not performing competence, even though competence was exactly what he was quietly communicating. He was simply there, the way a man stands when he's already done everything else he knows how to do, and this is the last door he has left. She'd stood at doors like that herself. That was as far as she followed the thought. Chet gave Wade the stove room, as promised, and assigned him the worst jobs on the property by the next morning, which was probably his way of making a point. The south fence line had been battered by 3 consecutive storms over the winter and needed full reposting across nearly a mile of rough ground. The irrigation channel that fed the eastern pasture had a partial blockage that 2 previous hands had looked at and decided wasn't their problem. And the North Range, which nobody liked riding because the terrain was unpredictable and the wind came down off the mountains, without warning, needed someone to check on the small winter herd that had been left up there. Wade took the list without comment and went to work. What Adeline noticed first, and she noticed because she was watching, which she told herself was simply due diligence on a new hire, was that he didn't ask for help when he didn't need it. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. Most men asked for more than they needed and delivered less than they promised. It was a pattern she'd come to expect. Wade worked the way some people breathe without announcing it, without waiting for acknowledgement, just steadily and continuously until the thing was done. He had the south fence reposted in 4 days. The 2 previous hands who'd attempted it had spent 3 days between them and left it half-finished. She didn't say anything to him about it. She filed it away. What she noticed second was how he handled the horses. Silver Briar ran 30 working horses alongside its cattle operation. And horses, like people, had personalities that didn't always cooperate with what was needed from them. There was a gray gelding named Copper Terrible Name for a gray horse, but that was the previous owner's doing, who had developed a stubborn habit of refusing the south gate. He'd dump riders, he'd back up until he hit a fence post. He'd done it to 4 different hands, and nobody had solved it. Wade spent 20 minutes with Copper on the 3rd morning. Just the 2 of them, no audience, in the corral before anyone else was up. That afternoon, Copper went through the south gate without hesitation. None of the hands said anything about it directly. Men don't always like admitting someone else figured out a problem they'd given up on. But Adeline watched it from the window of her office, and she found herself setting down her ledger book and just watching. She didn't understand horses the way some people did. She respected them, managed them practically, but the instinct some riders had the almost wordless communication, she'd never had that herself. Watching Wade with Copper was like watching someone speak a language she'd always wanted to learn. She went back to her ledger. Jamie, meanwhile, had discovered the stable. The boy was quiet by nature, which made sense given everything, but quiet didn't mean withdrawn. He showed up at the stable door on the second morning, apparently having determined that this was an appropriate thing to do, and stood there until one of the hands noticed him and put him to work sweeping. He swept with the focused concentration of someone who'd decided to be useful and was going to be as useful as possible about it. By the end of the first week, he knew every horse by name. By the end of the second week, the hands had stopped noticing him in the way people stop noticing furniture like he was simply part of the room, and the room felt right with him in it. It was Tom Birch, her oldest hand, who first mentioned it to Adeline. Tom was 61 and had been at Silver Briar for 11 years and had the particular freedom of long tenure, meaning he said what he thought within certain limits, and Adeline let him. "That boy's got good hands with animals," Tom said one evening, settling onto the fence beside her while they watched the evening feed. "Reminds me of a boy I worked with years back over in Wyoming. Same quiet way about him. Those kind usually end up good with livestock." "He's 8, Adeline said. 8-year-olds become something eventually," Tom said, with the philosophical manner of a man who'd seen enough of the world to take the long view on most things. Adeline looked over at the stable door, where Jamie was visible through the gap, carrying a water bucket that was slightly too heavy for him, with the expression of someone who was not going to ask for help with it. She thought of her own father, who'd started her on ranch work at 7. She went back inside. 3 weeks in, Adeline was reviewing the spring water schedule with Chet when he brought up Wade. "He found something in the East Channel," Chet said. His tone was neutral in the studied way of someone keeping an opinion out of their voice by conscious effort. "What kind of something?" "A collapse in the secondary line. About 40 yards upstream from where the blockage was." Chet set the water schedule down on her desk. "He says if it holds through to summer, we lose water pressure to the eastern pasture. Which means the grass doesn't grow the way it should. Which means by July we're moving cattle we didn't plan to move." Adeline looked up. "How did the previous inspection miss it?" Chet was quiet for a moment. "The collapse is in a section you have to go into the channel to see properly. Most folks look at it from the bank." "Did he go in?" "Apparently." She stared at the water schedule. "Get it fixed." "It's going to cost—" "I know what it costs, Chet. Get it fixed." He picked up the schedule and left. Adeline sat with that for a while. The eastern pasture fed roughly a third of the summer herd rotation. A water pressure failure in July would have been a real problem, the kind that quietly compounded until it became expensive, and the kind of expensive that didn't show itself until it was too late to be cheap about it. Wade had found it by going where others hadn't bothered to go. She thought again about Copper walking through the south gate, about the south fence line finished in 4 days, about Jamie carrying that water bucket. She got up from her desk and walked out to the yard, and she stood there for a few minutes in the cold afternoon air, not entirely sure why she'd come outside. She told herself she was checking the sky. The sky was fine. Gideon Strake arrived that Friday. He came the way he always came, uninvited, and driving a buckboard that was nicer than most people's houses, with 2 riders flanking him at a distance that was meant to look casual and wasn't. Gideon was 51, broad-shouldered, with silver in his hair that he wore the way some men wear expensive boots as a deliberate statement about himself. His ranch, the Diamond Cross, was Silver Briar's nearest neighbor and, in Gideon's estimation, Silver Briar's natural future. He'd been suggesting the merger for 3 years. Adeline had been declining for 3 years. The dance had become familiar enough that she could predict his opening line before he got through the door. She was wrong this time. His opening line was about Wade. "Heard you picked up a stray," Gideon said, settling into the chair across from her desk without being invited to sit. "Some drifter with a kid I hired a new hand," Adeline said. "Yes. Where's he from?" "East of Billings, most recently. And before that." "That's not your business, Gideon." He smiled. It was the smile he used when he was deciding to be patient. "I'm just asking because I care about this operation, Adeline. You know that. A woman running a ranch this size alone. I'm not alone. I have 12 hands, a foreman, and 2 barn workers. Needs to be careful about who she lets get close." He leaned back. "A drifter with no ties to this valley No references you can verify. I've verified what I need to verify, she said, which was not exactly true, but it closed the line of conversation. Gideon looked at her for a moment, then the smile again. Well, you always did make up your own mind, he stood. The offer's still open. Has been for 3 years. Still will be 3 years from now if you want it. Just think about what happens if you have a bad summer. I'll think about what happens if I have a good one, she said. He left. She watched him from the window, walking back to his buckboard. He stopped partway across the yard and said something to one of his riders. The rider glanced toward the stable. Then they climbed up and drove out. Adeline turned back to her desk. She didn't like that pause. The glance toward the stable. She filed it away with the other things she was accumulating. The night she heard the humming, she was coming back late from a walk along the south fence. She sometimes did that after supper, when the day's business was finished, and she wanted the particular kind of quiet that only came from being outside without a purpose. The moon was nearly full. The yard was silver and dark in patches, and the stable light was on, which meant someone was doing a late check on the animals. She heard it before she saw him. A man's voice, low and tuneless enough to be called humming only by courtesy. More like a melody held loosely in the throat, the kind of thing someone does without thinking, just to fill the silence. She knew the melody. She stopped. The recognition was not intellectual. It didn't come with a thought. It was entirely physical, a cold spreading outward from her chest before her mind had time to catch up with what was happening. She stood in the dark outside the stable wall and listened. The melody continued. Just a few bars repeated, the kind of thing someone might hum absently while checking on a horse in the night. She had heard that melody once before in her life, in the dark, in the cold. When she was 20 years old and her wagon had gone over, and the world was pain and freezing and confusion, and there had been a voice in the dark, a young man's voice, and he'd hummed to her because she kept losing consciousness and he needed her to stay awake. And later, she could not have told anyone what he looked like or what his name was. But she remembered the melody like she remembered the cold. She stood very still. Her hand found the stable wall. She made herself breathe. The humming stopped. She heard the soft sound of a stall door closing and boots on the stable floor, and the light shifted as someone moved toward the stable's far exit. She did not go in. She went back to the house. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a long time, and she told herself she was mistaken, that it was a common melody, that there were 100 cowboys humming 100 songs on any given night in Montana, and she'd simply recognized a tune that was common enough, and her mind had made something of it that wasn't there. She thought about the scar on his left hand. She'd noticed it the first day and filed it and not returned to it. Now she returned to it. Her rescuer, the boy, she'd always thought of him as the boy, because he'd seemed young even in her fragmentary memory of him, had cut his hand on the wreckage of her wagon. She remembered that specifically because she'd been aware enough at one point to see the blood on the snow. And she'd tried to tell him he should wrap it, and he'd said something like, "Don't worry about me. Just keep your eyes open. Stay with me now." She pressed her hands flat on the table. It was a scar, a common melody. She was connecting things because she wanted them connected, which was exactly the kind of thinking she'd spent years training herself out of. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. She started watching him differently after that. Not openly. She was careful about it, but she began paying attention to the things she'd noted and dismissed, lining them up against what she knew. He was from Montana originally. He'd said that, or implied it, in passing, that he'd grown up in the territory before his family moved on. He was 42 now, which would have made him 19 or 20 in 1877. She didn't ask him directly. She filed it. He understood water. He understood terrain. He understood the way cold weather worked on infrastructure in ways that went beyond general experience, the kind of knowledge that came from growing up in the mountains, not from working ranches in lower ground. She watched him with the horses, with the hands, with Jamie. She watched him in the yard one afternoon when Chet came to him with something he clearly disagreed, with a decision Adeline had made about rotating the north herd, and she watched Wade listen, consider it, and then simply do the job as directed. No argument, no sulking. He expressed his opinion once, directly and without drama. And when Chet told him the decision stood, he said, "All right," and went to work. Men who did that were rarer than they should have been. She sat with everything she was accumulating. And then one evening, when the light was going and she was standing at the kitchen window, she saw him walk across the yard with the particular long stride that meant he was going to check the North Range fence before dark. She watched him until he rounded the corner of the stable. She noticed the way he turned his head slightly as he walked, listening for something. She turned from the window. Her hands were not entirely steady. She didn't know what she was going to do about what she thought she knew. She didn't know if it was true. But the part that was already starting to mean something to her, the part she didn't want to examine too carefully yet, was the possibility that it was true, and that if it was, this man had arrived at her door in the worst year of his life, recognized her, and said nothing. Not a word, not a suggestion, not a hint. He had asked for the hardest job she had, and a warm place for his son to sleep, and he had left 12 years of unspeakable debt sitting on the table between them like a hand of cards he'd decided not to play. She stood in her kitchen. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains the way it always did, and somewhere across the yard, a man she might owe her life to was checking her fence in the dark. Adeline Marlowe, who had spent 12 years running Silver Briar alone and making every decision herself and answering to no one and needing nothing she couldn't provide for herself, stood in her kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She wasn't sure there was a clean word for it. It was something between recognition and grief and the particular ache of a question you've carried so long you'd stop believing it would ever have an answer. She put on water for coffee. She waited. And upstairs, on her kitchen table, Jamie's schoolbook lay open at a page he'd been studying that afternoon, with a pencil mark in the margin where he'd stopped to ask her what a word meant, told him. He'd nodded like he was filing it carefully for later. She thought about that. She thought about the way this house had been quieter than it should have been for longer than she wanted to admit, and about how a boy with his boots by her door and his books on her table had changed the sound of the rooms without her giving permission for it to happen. Outside, the wind moved through the dark. The North Range fence was long. She waited until the water boiled, and then she poured it, and she stood at the window with her cup in both hands, and she thought about the things you carry alone, and the things that arrive without warning, and the difference between the two. She was still thinking about it when she heard his boots on the porch steps. He came in out of the cold, and he hung his hat on the peg by the door. And he said, "Fence is good." In the straightforward way, he said everything. And she said, "Good." And she asked if he wanted coffee, and he said he wouldn't turn it down. And for a while, they sat in her kitchen with the wind going outside and the lamp low between them. And neither of them said anything more. But the silence was different from what it had been. Something had shifted without being named. And Adeline sat across from Wade Hollister in the lamplight, and she looked at the scar on his left hand resting on her kitchen table, and she thought, "I know who you are." She thought, "And you know who I am." She thought, "Why haven't you said a word?" She didn't ask. Not yet. The question had waited 12 years. Could wait a little longer. The coffee had gone cold before either of them moved. Wade set his cup down and stood without making a production of it, the way he did everything simply, without announcing it first. He said good night in that flat, plain way of his, the kind of good night that didn't ask for anything back. He took his hat from the peg by the door. He went out into the dark. Adeline sat at the table for another 10 minutes after his boots faded off the porch steps. Then she got up, poured the cold coffee into the basin, and went to bed. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The question she hadn't asked sat in the room with her like a third person, kept turning it over, examining it from different angles, trying to find the angle that made it simple. There wasn't one, because if she was right, if Wade Hollister was in fact the young man who'd pulled her from the wreckage of her wagon 12 years ago and kept her alive through the worst night of her life, then the question wasn't just who he was. The question was why he'd stayed silent. And that second question was the one that wouldn't let her sleep, because she couldn't find an answer for it that was small enough to dismiss. A man in debt asks for help from the person who owes him something. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked in her experience. You collected what was owed to you, especially when you had nothing left. Wade had nothing left. That was plain. The worn coat, the saddlebag with almost nothing in it, the boy who'd been sleeping in bunkhouses and haylofts across 3 counties. He'd arrived at her gate needing everything and said almost nothing about himself. She stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind had eased and the night had gone still. She made herself stop thinking about it, and eventually she slept. And in the morning, the ranch needed her attention the way it always did. And she got up and gave it that attention. And she did not speak to Wade Hollister any differently than she had the day before. But she watched. What she hadn't expected was that watching him would keep changing what she saw. The first month had given her competence. The fence, the channel, the horses. Quiet and steady and better at the work than anyone she'd hired in years. She'd filed that under useful and moved on. The second month started showing her something else. It started with the irrigation argument. The Eastern Channel repair had been completed, but Wade had come to her with a concern that went beyond the immediate fix. He believed the main feed line from the northern ridge had a slow structural failure, not something catastrophic, not yet, but the kind of thing that got worse every winter and would eventually become catastrophic. He had a proposal for rerouting it, using the terrain's natural grade, which would cost money now and save considerably more money later. Chet thought it was overreach. A hired hand proposing capital infrastructure changes was, in Chet's view, outside the appropriate scope of being a hired hand. Adeline asked Wade to lay it out for her. He did. He used a stick and the dirt of the yard, drawing lines that made sense as he drew them. He explained the grade, the pressure, the way freeze-thaw cycles worked on older clay-lined channels. He explained what failure would look like in practice, and when he estimated it would happen. He was not performing expertise. He was just explaining what he understood. When he finished, he said, "It's your call. I'm just telling you what I see." And then he waited. He didn't press. He didn't add anything to try to persuade her further. He said what he had to say, and then he left the decision where it belonged. That, more than the technical knowledge itself, was what caught her. She approved the reroute. It was the right call, and she knew it. But she also found herself thinking, afterward, about the men she'd dealt with over the years, who had made recommendations with opinions layered so thick around them that it was nearly impossible to separate the actual information from the desire to be seen as important. Wade had no apparent interest in being seen as important. He had an interest in the waterline being correct. She told Chet to put him in charge of the project. Chet's jaw went tight for a moment. "He's a 30-day hire," Chet said. "Then extend him," Adeline said. Chet said nothing else. He went and did what she'd asked, which was his job, and he knew it, even when he disagreed. The waterline project took 12 days. Wade ran it quietly, moving the hands through the work with a minimum of friction. He had a way of directing that didn't feel like directing. He'd explain what needed doing, and then he'd do his share of it alongside the men, which meant they didn't feel managed. They felt like they were doing a job together. It was a small distinction that turned out to matter considerably in practice. Tom Birch stopped by Adeline's office one afternoon and stood in the doorway without coming in, the way he did when he had something to say that he wasn't sure was his place to say. "You going to keep him?" Tom asked. Adeline looked up from her ledger. "Keep who?" Tom gave her the look of a man who was 61 years old and had very limited patience for pretending not to know things. "Wade," he said. She set her pen down. "What makes you ask?" "Because the men are following him," Tom said simply. "Not making a fuss about it. Nobody's decided anything. But when he says something about how a job should go, they listen to it different than they listen to Chet." He paused. "I'm not saying anything against Chet. Chet's done his job for years and he's solid. I'm just telling you what I see." Adeline considered that for a moment. "What do you know about him?" she asked. "The men talk. Has anything come out about where he's from, what his situation is?" Tom leaned against the doorframe. "Grew up in Montana, somewhere north of here. Lost his wife to fever 4 years back or thereabouts. Had a string of bad luck on small operations. Drought took one, fire took part of another one. The kind of trouble that follows the territory sometimes, not the kind that follows a man." He paused again. "The boy's healthy, which tells you something. Hard times don't affect a healthy boy's temperament unless home is bad. Jamie's temperament is fine. Adeline nodded slowly. He doesn't talk about himself much, Tom added, but what he does say checks out. She picked up her pen again. Thank you, Tom. He nodded and left. She stared at the ledger without seeing it for a while. The kind of trouble that follows the territory, not the kind that follows a man. She thought about what it meant to read a person that way. Tom had been doing it for 60 years, and he was rarely wrong. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. Gideon came back 3 weeks later. This time he brought a different approach. He left his riders at the gate and came alone, which was new, and he came with something in his hand, an envelope that he set on her desk with the careful deliberateness of someone who had practiced the gesture. What's in it? Adeline asked. She didn't reach for it. An offer, he said. A formal one this time, written by my attorney in Billings. He sat down. Adeline, I've been patient for 3 years, you know I have. And I respect that you run this place the way you want to run it. I always have. He folded his hands on his knee. But you're going into a summer with an uncertain water situation, a North Range that's been undermanaged for 2 seasons, and a new foreman situation that isn't resolved. That's 3 problems at once. The water situation is resolved, she said. We rerouted the main feed line. Something shifted in his expression. Just briefly. When did that happen? Recently. He recovered smoothly. Still, the offer is generous. I'd ask you to read it before you decide. I'll read it, she said. She didn't touch it. He watched her for a moment. Then he glanced toward the window that looked out on the yard. Through it, Wade was visible, working with 2 of the hands on the far side of the corral. I've been making inquiries, Gideon said. His voice was still conversational. About your new hire. Adeline went very still. She kept her expression neutral. Have you? He's got a string of operations behind him that all ended badly. Crawford's before you, and before that, the Halloran place over in Fergus County. Before that, the old Jessup run. He paused. That's 3 operations in 6 years, all gone or reduced to nothing. Drought and fire, Adeline said. Territory trouble. His eyebrows rose slightly. You've looked into it yourself. I always look into my hires. He smiled, but it was thinner than his usual smile. Then you know his background is shaky. I know his last 3 employers all had serious losses. I also know the losses weren't his fault. She met his eyes. What exactly is the concern you're trying to raise, Gideon? Say it straight. He leaned forward slightly. I'm saying a man who shows up with nothing but a kid and a story about bad luck, who immediately starts making himself indispensable, who proposes expensive projects and gets them approved. That's a pattern I've seen before. Men who know how to look useful until they've got their position, and then the position is what they were after. The silence in the room went flat. That's what you're saying, Adeline said. I'm saying be careful. I appreciate your concern. She picked up her pen. Close the door on your way out. His jaw tightened. He stood slowly. He left the envelope on her desk. He didn't close the door on his way out. She closed her ledger, stood up, crossed the room, and closed it herself. Then she stood with her hand on the doorframe and looked out at the yard, where Wade was showing one of the younger hands how to read the way a horse holds its weight when something's bothering it. He wasn't lecturing. He was just demonstrating, and then he stepped back and let the kid try it. And when the kid got it close enough, Wade gave a short nod and moved on to the next thing. She thought about Gideon's word, pattern. She thought about the envelope on her desk. She went back and picked it up and opened it. She read the offer. It was generous. She'd give him that. It was genuinely generous, structured to protect her existing equity, and the terms for the operational merger would leave her with real authority over Silver Briar's direct management for a period of years. She read it twice, because she was rigorous about that sort of thing. Then she set it in her top drawer and went back to work. Jamie got sick in the middle of the month. Nothing serious, as it turned out. A fever that ran for 3 days and left him weak and miserable and embarrassed about being weak and miserable, which Adeline recognized as a very specific kind of 8-year-old pride that didn't appreciate being treated like an invalid. She brought soup to the stoveroom on the first day and found Wade already there, sitting on the edge of Jamie's cot with a damp cloth and a face that had closed in the way faces do when you're frightened and not letting it show. How high? She asked. 102 this morning, Wade said. Come down some. She set the soup on the small table. She looked at Jamie, who looked back at her from under a wool blanket with the expression of someone who had been through enough in his short life to take illness as a personal insult rather than a misfortune. "I'm fine," Jamie said. His voice was rough and about 40% convincing. "You've got a fever," Adeline said. "So you're not fine, but you're going to be." "Pa doesn't need to stay," Jamie said. "He's got work." "Your pa's going to stay," Adeline said. She looked at Wade. "I'll tell Chet. Take what you need." Wade looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Briefly, something between gratitude and discomfort, which she was coming to understand, was how he handled being given things he hadn't asked for. He wasn't used to it. He accepted it, but it cost him something. "Thank you," he said. She left them, she told Chet. Chet managed without comment, which was its own kind of statement about how the month had changed things on the ranch. On the second day, she brought more soup and a book from her own shelf, an adventure story, the kind with clear heroes and clear villains and forward momentum, which she'd thought Jamie might like. He was awake enough to accept it. He held it in both hands and looked at the cover. "Years ago," she said. "Is it good?" "I thought so." He opened it carefully, like it was borrowed, and he wanted to return it in good condition. Which, she supposed it was. "Miss Adeline," he said, without looking up from the first page. "Yeah, do you have kids?" She was quiet for a moment. Wade, who was across the small room sharpening a harness buckle, went still. "No," she said. Jamie considered this. "How come?" Jamie, Wade said. His voice was quiet. "It's all right," Adeline said. She looked at the boy. "Just how things went," she said. "Sometimes things don't go the way you figured they would." Jamie nodded slowly. He seemed to find this acceptable, the kind of honest non-answer that children respect more than the elaborate explanations adults construct to avoid saying they don't know. "This house is big for one person," he said. He said it without judgment, simply as an observation, an 8-year-old accounting for the available space. Adeline looked around the small stove room, the narrow cot, the 2 saddlebags against the wall, the 1 lantern, the small window with frost on the corner of the glass. She thought about the house she'd walked back to every evening for 12 years. "Yeah," she said, "it is." She left the book with him. She walked back to the house. She stood in the front room for a moment, with the afternoon light coming through the west window, and she thought about square footage and silence, and what it meant when a house felt like the right size, and what it meant when it didn't. She went to her office, and she opened the ledger, and she did not think about it anymore for the rest of the day. The day Gideon's rider showed up at the bunkhouse was the day things changed. It was a Tuesday evening, late, and most of the hands were in from the day's work when the Diamond Cross rider, a man named Pollard, who everybody knew as Gideon's particular errand runner, rode into the yard and asked for Wade Hollister specifically. One of the younger hands came to get Adeline. She wasn't sure why he came to her instead of Chet. She supposed things had shifted enough by then that coming to her felt like the right instinct. She went to the yard. Pollard was still on horseback. Wade was standing below him in the yard, arms loose at his sides, listening to whatever Pollard was saying with the still expression of a man who was hearing something he wanted to make sure he understood correctly. Adeline stopped at the edge of the porch. "Just delivering the message," Pollard was saying. "Mr. Strake wants you to understand that your employment situation here may not be as secure as you think it is, and that if you're looking for a longer-term arrangement in the valley—" "I heard you the first time," Wade said. "Mr. Strake is prepared to offer you a position at Diamond Cross at a rate considerably above what you're making here, if you're—" "Tell Mr. Strake no thank you." Pollard paused. He'd clearly expected more negotiation. "You might want to think on it. Mr. Strake isn't the kind of man who makes the same offer twice." "I understand," Wade said. "No thank you." Pollard looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked up and saw Adeline on the porch. His expression changed slightly. "Evening, Miss Marlowe," he said. "Pollard," she said. He touched his hat brim, turned his horse, and rode out. The yard was quiet. Several of the hands were watching from the bunkhouse doorway. Wade turned and saw Adeline on the porch, and his expression gave nothing away, which was usual. He walked toward her. "You heard that," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Most of it," she said. He looked out toward the gate where Pollard had gone. "He's been watching this ranch," Wade said. "I don't know what his interest is in moving me out of it, but that's what that was." "I know what his interest is," Adeline said. Wade looked at her. He wants the property, she said. He's wanted it for 3 years. He thinks you being here is making it harder for him to get it. Wade was quiet for a moment. Is he right? She looked at him. It was a direct question, and she appreciated that because she was tired of indirect ones. He's not wrong, she said. Wade nodded once. He looked back out at the gate. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not with any drama. Just stating it. I didn't ask you to, she said. She went back inside. She stood in her front room again, and this time she didn't go to the office. She sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, and she thought about Gideon trying to buy Wade away from her ranch, the way he'd tried to buy the ranch itself. The audacity of it had a specific flavor, the flavor of a man who believed that everything had a price, and that the only question was whether you'd been offered the right number yet. Wade had said no without thinking about it. She thought about that for a long time. 3 days later, she noticed him limping. Not badly. He was covering it. The kind of limp a man does his best to walk out of because he doesn't want anyone to see it, which usually means you've done something to yourself that you didn't mention, because mentioning it would mean stopping, and stopping wasn't something you could afford. She waited until the hands were at supper. She found him at the water trough, working on a saddle. Show me your leg, she said. He looked up. It's fine. Wade. He set the saddle down. He pulled up his right pant leg without further argument. There was a bruise from the knee down, deep purple going green at the edges, the kind that meant something had landed on him or he'd hit something solid. What happened? She asked. The North Range fence threw a post on me, he said. Ice came loose under it. I should have seen it. When? 2 days ago. She crouched down and looked at it. Nothing was broken, she could see that much, and she'd seen enough ranch injuries over the years to know the difference. But it should have been. Wrapped, and it hadn't been. Sit down, she said. Sit down, Wade. He sat on the edge of the trough. She went to the stable and came back with what she needed, and she wrapped his leg with the efficient practicality of someone who'd done it before. He sat still and didn't make a production of being stoic about it, which she appreciated. Some men performed their toughness. Wade just had it. You should have said something, she said. It wasn't serious enough to say something about. It's serious enough that you've been limping for 2 days. He said nothing. She tied off the wrap and stood up. She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance in the way he did when he was deciding whether to say something. What? She said. He looked at her. You don't have to do this. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm doing it. The thing that crossed his face was brief and unguarded and gone quickly, which told her it was real. He wasn't a man who showed much. What he showed when it slipped through was honest. Thank you, he said. She handed him the remaining wrap. Change it tomorrow morning. She walked back toward the house. She didn't look back. But she heard him stand up from the trough, heard the saddle come back up into his hands, heard the quiet sounds of a man getting back to work. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen. She thought about the scar on his left hand, and the melody in the dark, and a 19-year-old boy carrying a woman through the snow and staying beside her all night, and leaving before she woke up, and never saying a word. She thought about a man arriving at her gate 23 years older, wearing a coat thin at the elbows, with his son beside him. She thought about what it cost to keep carrying something you'd never put down. She thought about Gideon Strake and his offer, and his rider, and his patience of 3 years. She thought about Jamie's voice. This house is big for one person, and the way the boy had said it. Not cruelly, just with the frank accounting of a child who didn't understand yet why the truth needed softening. Kitchen was warm. Outside, the April evening was cooling fast, the way it did in Montana, and the light was going long and amber over the western hills, and the ranch was settling into its end-of-day sounds. And Adeline stood in the middle of it all, and understood that something had quietly become true without her deciding it should. She didn't know yet what to do with that truth, but she'd stopped telling herself she was imagining it. That was enough for now. The water on the stove began to steam, and she turned to it, and somewhere across the yard in the small room off the stable, she could hear faintly, just barely, the sound of a child's voice reading aloud from a book. Her book. His voice sounded like someone who was getting better. The book came back to her shelf 3 days after Jamie's fever broke. He brought it himself, carrying it with both hands the way he'd taken it, and he set it on the kitchen table where she was working and said, I finished it. Thank you, he said it, the way his father said things plain, no extra words around it. Then he stood there for a moment, with his hands at his sides. Did you like it? She asked. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He wasn't the kind of kid who gave automatic answers. The ending was too fast, he said. The part in the middle where they're crossing the river was the best part. She looked at him. That was my favorite part too. He nodded, satisfied, like something had been confirmed. Then he went back out to the stable, and Adeline sat at her table with the book in front of her and found herself almost smiling, which was not an expression she put on her face, often or without reason. She put it back on her shelf. She went to work. May came in on a warm current that felt like a promise the territory wasn't entirely making in good faith. Montana Springs had a habit of offering 3 warm days and then reminding you that the mountains were still there and they still had opinions about the weather. The hands knew it. They moved through the warmer days with the efficiency of people who understood that the window wouldn't stay open long. Wade knew it better than any of them. It was Tom Birch who first said something about the sky. He came to Adeline's office on a Thursday morning in the second week of May, and he didn't knock, which meant it was something he'd decided needed saying before he lost the nerve to say it. Something's coming, Tom said. She looked up from the spring cattle count she'd been reconciling. Storm? I don't know what exactly, but the air's wrong. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. I've been in this valley 30 years. The air's wrong the way it gets before the big ones. She looked out the window. The sky was clear, blue in the way that looked convincing. Have you talked to Wade? She asked. Tom paused. I was going to ask you about that. He was up before first light this morning. I saw him out by the north ridge with a glass, looking at the snowpack. She set her pen down. Tom turned to go, then stopped. He's worried about the diversion dam, he said. I heard him mention it to one of the boys yesterday. Said the winter put more stress on it than it looked from the outside. She was already standing up. She found Wade at the dam an hour later, on foot, having left his horse at the ridge, because the ground near the dam's base had gotten soft in a way he didn't trust with a horse's weight. He was crouched at the base of the eastern wall, one hand pressed flat against the stones. He looked up when he heard her coming. You shouldn't be this close to it, he said. It's my dam. He didn't argue. He stood up and moved back, and she came to where he'd been and looked at what he'd been looking at. The mortar between the base stones was dark with moisture in a pattern that shouldn't have been there. Not leakage from the top, not runoff from the sides. Coming from within. How bad? She asked. I don't know yet, he said. But the snowpack up on the north ridge is heavy this year. If we get a hard, warm rain on top of it, he stopped. He didn't finish it because he didn't need to. She knew what a hard, warm rain on a heavy snowpack meant for a dam with compromised mortar. She'd grown up on this ranch. She'd heard the stories from her father about the flood of 1871 that had taken 2 barns and 60 head from the property south of theirs. What do we do? She asked. I need to get into the base section and see how far the compromise goes, he said. And I need to look at the terrain between the dam and the lower pasture. There may be options for diversion if it comes to that. Maybe. He looked at the dam. The old irrigation network runs through the east side of the lower pasture. Most of it's been dry for years. If the grade is still workable, he stopped again. I need to look at it before I say anything more certain than maybe. She studied his face. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't minimizing either. He was doing what he always did, which was looking at the actual problem with the actual information available and not adding anything that wasn't there. Do it, she said. Whatever you need, it'll pull men off other work. Then it'll pull them. What's more important than this? He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded and turned back to the dam. He spent 2 days on it. He went into the dam's base section with young Danny Reeves, who was 22 and small enough to fit into spaces where the structural investigation required getting into spaces. And they came out the second afternoon with a picture that was not good but was specific, which Adeline had learned was always better than vague. Vague meant you were guessing. Specific meant you could plan. The eastern section of the dam's base had 3 compromised joints. Not catastrophic yet, but the pressure of a significant snowmelt event pushing through the existing structure would likely open those joints faster than anyone could respond to in the moment. The estimate for a full repair of the base, the right repair, the one that would hold for decades, was money Adeline had but would hurt to spend mid-season. Wade laid all of this out at the kitchen table that evening, with Chet present and Tom Birch and Adeline. Chet thought they should do the repair now. He was probably right, but he also acknowledged that weather didn't always wait for repairs to finish, and if the rain came before the repair was complete, they'd be worse off than if they hadn't started. Tom thought they should move the lower pasture cattle now, before anything happened. Wade had a third option. He'd walk the terrain. He drew it out on paper. The old irrigation network that ran through the east side of the lower pasture was still viable. The channels were silted and overgrown, but the grade was correct. If they could clear the primary channel and cut one new connecting section across the southeast corner of the grazing land, which meant deliberately sacrificing that section of pasture, they could create an emergency diversion route. If the dam gave way, the water would follow the new channel and miss the barns, miss most of the herd, miss the structures. It would ruin the southeast pasture, a season's worth of grazing land. And it would mean doing the work before they knew whether the dam would fail. Chet leaned back in his chair. You want to tear up good pasture on the chance of a flood that might not come. Yes, Wade said. That's grazing we need for the July rotation. I know. Chet looked at Adeline. You're not seriously considering this. She was looking at the diagram Wade had drawn. It was clear and simple, and the logic of it was sound. She could see the grade, see how the water would move, see why it would work if it was done correctly. She thought about her father's story of the flood of 1871. How long to do the channel work? She asked. 4 or 5 days if I have enough men, Wade said. 2 days if I have all of them. You'll have all of them, she said. Chet's jaw went tight. Adeline. We can replant the southeast corner next season, she said. We can't rebuild a barn. She folded the diagram. Start tomorrow. Chet stood up and left. Tom sat for a moment longer looking at the table. Then he looked at Wade. The boy who doesn't go for the safe bet, Tom said. He said it without judgment, more like a man identifying a species. The safe bet here is losing everything on a bad night, Wade said. Tom nodded slowly. He stood up. He left. Wade began gathering up his papers. Wade, Adeline said. He looked up. You're sure about the grade? She said. I'm trusting the grade here. He held her eyes. I'm sure. She nodded. She left him at the table. She went to her room and she lay awake, thinking about diversion channels and dam mortar, and the very particular gamble of destroying something good to try to save something better, and whether the instinct to trust the judgment of a man she'd known less than 2 months was reason or something else entirely. She decided she'd already made the decision. She stopped turning it over and went to sleep. The work started at first light. Wade had 12 men, and the 2 barn workers and Jamie, who was not officially assigned to anything, but showed up at the channel site by 7 in the morning with a shovel that was slightly too long for him and a look that made it clear he intended to be useful and would not be having any conversation about going back to the stable. Wade looked at him for a moment. Stay out of the deep sections, he said. Jamie nodded and went to work. The primary channel clearing was brutal. 12 years of silt and root growth didn't move easily, and the men went at it with the focused aggression of people who understood the stakes and had decided to do something about them. Wade worked alongside them. He didn't supervise from a distance. He was in the channel with them, his boots full of black water, moving material by hand where the tools didn't fit. Adeline watched from the ridge for an hour in the morning and then went to do the 100 other things the ranch required, because standing watching wasn't helping, and she'd already said everything she had to say. Came back in the early afternoon. The primary channel was 2/3 cleared. She stood at the ridge and looked at the dam. The sky to the northwest had changed. It wasn't dark yet, but it had taken on the flat gray quality that mountain weather used as a first announcement, the kind of sky that made experienced people look at it twice. She went down to where Wade was working. The sky, she said. He was already looking at it. He'd already been looking at it. I know, he said. We need 2 more hours on the main channel and then the new connecting section. He looked at his men. We'll get one. She understood what that meant. What can I do? He was already moving. Get the cattle off the lower section now. Don't wait for the channel to be done. Move them to the north and upper pastures. She went. She took Tom and two of the hands who weren't on the channel, and they went for the lower pasture herd. Cattle knew. Animals usually did, and these ones were already edgy, bunching at the high end of the pasture, which saved some of the work. Getting them through the gate to the upper section took the better part of an hour, and it was not elegant cattle in that mood don't cooperate, and they lost 2 calves briefly and had to go back for them. And by the time the last of the lower herd was through the upper gate, the sky to the northwest had made its full intentions clear. The clouds were building in the specific stacked way that meant serious precipitation, and the temperature had dropped 5 degrees since morning, which was the warm front the snowpack had been waiting for. Adeline rode back to the channel. Wade had every man working at double time. The primary channel was clear. They were cutting the new connecting section with whatever they had: shovels, picks, 2 plows they'd driven out from the equipment barn, and, in one place where the ground was harder than expected, blasting powder that Danny Reeves had found in the supply shed and Wade had looked at for approximately 2 seconds before deciding it was necessary. The blast was controlled and effective, and it carved out the last hard section of the connecting channel in one application. Chet, who had come back around noon having thought better of his departure, looked at the blasted earth and said nothing. He picked up a shovel and started moving the loose material. That, Adeline thought, was the most honest thing Chet had done in a long time. The rain came at 4 in the afternoon. Not a gentle rain. Montana didn't do gentle when it decided to commit. It came in fast and hard off the mountains, and within 20 minutes the ground was running with it, and within an hour the creek levels were rising in the way that meant the snowpack was giving up its winter all at once. Wade had the men out of the channel and onto the high ground. He stood at the ridge and watched the dam. Adeline stood beside him. The rain was cold and coming sideways, and neither of them had come prepared for weather, and both of them were soaked through, and she was aware of that in the abstract way you're aware of physical discomfort when something larger is happening. "The channel's not finished," she said. "The critical section is done," he said. "The connecting cut gives the water somewhere to go. That's the piece that matters. If the dam holds, we tore up the southeast corner for nothing. If the dam holds, we tore up the southeast corner for nothing," he agreed. He said it evenly, without apology. It was the bargain they'd made, and he wasn't pretending otherwise. They stood in the rain and watched. The water was coming down off the north ridge in sheets now, and the creek that fed the dam was running brown and high and fast. She could see it from where she stood. She could hear it over the rain, the particular deep rushing sound of too much water moving too fast. The dam held through the first hour. She was starting to think it might hold through all of it when Wade grabbed her arm. She heard it before she saw it, a sound like the earth clearing its throat. The eastern section of the dam's base let go, not all at once. It didn't collapse the way she'd imagined it would collapse, dramatically, all at once. It gave way in stages, first a crack that she could see from the ridge as a dark line opening in the whetstone, and then the pressure of the water found that line and pushed into it, and then the eastern section failed. The water came through. It came down the slope fast and certain, the way water always moved when you gave it a downhill path without hesitation, without compromise, following the grade of the land exactly as Wade had said it would, and it followed the grade of the land into the new channel. She watched it happen. The water hit the cleared primary channel, hesitated for 1 terrible second at the connecting section, and then the grade took it and it turned, and it went into the southeast pasture the way they had intended it to go. Not toward the barns, not toward the herd. Into the cleared pasture they had deliberately given it. The barns were dry. She stood in the rain with water running off her hat brim and down her collar, and she watched her southeast pasture flood, and she thought, it worked. It worked because the grade was right, and the man beside her had walked it himself and been sure of what he was sure of. Beside her, Wade let out a breath. Just one breath. It was the most she'd ever heard him express about anything. She looked at him. He was watching the water find its new path through the channel with an expression that wasn't triumph. It was more like the look of a man who had made a careful argument and watched it proven right, and was quietly relieved that it had been right, because if it hadn't been, he would have had to account for it. "Barns are okay," she said. "Yeah," he said, "the herd is okay."
Yeah.
She looked at the eastern section of the dam, which was still releasing water through the broken joint, but steadily, not catastrophically. The main structure was holding. The breach was controlled enough that the diversion channel was managing the flow. "The dam's going to need real work," she said. "Yes," he said. "But it's not going anywhere tonight." She looked at him. He was soaked. His coat was dark with rain, his hat shapeless with it. He had a streak of mud across his jaw from the channel work, and his hands were raw where she could see them. He looked exactly like a man who had been in a ditch all day in bad weather, doing something difficult, which was what he had been. He looked like no one special. He looked like no one she was going to forget. She didn't examine that thought. She turned back to the ridge and called down to the men, and there was a general exhausted movement back toward the barn and the bunkhouse and dry clothes and food, and Adeline went with them because the rain was still coming down, and the ridge was no place to stand longer than necessary. Jamie was in the barn when they came in. He'd been there, she realized, since Wade had sent the men to high ground. He'd gone to the barn and been waiting. He was standing just inside the door with his father's spare coat over his own, and an expression that he was trying to make calm and not quite managing. When he saw his father come through the barn door, he went very still for a moment. Then he walked over in a careful, measured way that was clearly trying not to be a run. Wade crouched down when he got close. He put his hands on the boy's shoulders and looked at him. "It's okay," Wade said. "Barns are fine. Herd's fine." Jamie nodded. He was looking at his father's face with the focused attention of someone checking for damage. "You're soaked," Jamie said. "Yes, I am. You should change." "I'm going to." Jamie nodded again. He stepped back, giving his father room, and fell into step beside him as they moved through the barn toward the stable end. It was a movement so practiced and automatic that Adeline understood. It was simply how they moved through the world side by side, neither one ahead of the other. She watched them go. Tom appeared at her elbow. "Southeast pasture?" he asked. "Gone for this season," she said. "We'll replant in the fall." He nodded. He was looking at where Wade and Jamie had disappeared into the stable. "He called it right," Tom said. "He did, grade timing the whole thing." Tom scratched the back of his neck. 30 years in this valley, I've seen 2, maybe 3 men read terrain like that. It's not something you learn quick. "No," she agreed. Tom looked at her. He had 61 years of looking at people and reading them, and he aimed all of it at her for a moment. "You're not sending him back down the road when his 30 days are up," Tom said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. Tom put his hat on. "Good," he said, and walked away. Gideon came the next morning. She'd been expecting him. He had a way of appearing after significant events on Silver Briar, never during, when he might have to help, but afterward, when he could assess the damage and make his offer relevant again. He came this time without the envelope. He stood in her office doorway and looked at her with something that might have been genuine concern if she hadn't known him well enough to see the calculation underneath it. "I heard about the dam," he said. "It held," she said. "Eastern section let go, but the structure's sound. We diverted the flow." He paused. "Diverted how?" "Cut a new channel through the southeast corner. Water went where we put it." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him recalculating. "That was your plan," he said. "That was Wade's plan," she said. She said it deliberately, watching his face. "He walked the terrain 2 days ago and laid it out. We ran it exactly the way he drew it." Gideon came fully into the room. He moved to the window and looked out at the yard. Wade was visible across the way, talking to Chet, both of them looking at something in Chet's hand, a list, a schedule, something that needed doing. "He's been here less than 2 months, Gideon said. "He has, and you're trusting him with decisions that affect the whole operation." "I trust him with decisions he's earned the right to make," she said. "Yes." Gideon turned from the window. His face had gone to the version she liked, least the one where the patience had thinned, and the entitlement was showing through it. "He's a drifter," Gideon said, "with a trail of failed operations behind him and a kid and nothing else. And you're standing there telling me you trust him over you," she said. "Say it straight, Gideon." He stopped. "That's what this is," she said. "Not concern for Silver Briar. You don't want him here, because his being here makes your offer less compelling." She kept her voice level. "He saved this ranch yesterday. The barns are standing. The herd is safe. And the dam held because 2 days ago a man who came here with nothing but a saddlebag walked my terrain in the rain and told me exactly what would happen and exactly what to do about it. She looked at Gideon. Your advice was to accept the loss. The silence between them had an edge. The offer he started. Put it away, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The calculation was visible now, all of it, working through what this meant for his timeline and his leverage, and the patient pressure he'd been applying for 3 years. You're making a mistake, he said. Maybe, she said. It'll be my mistake to make. He left. She didn't watch him from the window this time. She sat at her desk, and she pulled out the ledger, and she looked at the line items for the southeast pasture replanting, and the dam repair and the channel work, and she added the costs up, and she sat with the total. It was substantial, not ruinous, substantial, and the barns were standing. She closed the ledger. She went outside. The morning after a flood was its own particular kind of ugly. Everything that the water had touched was still wet and marked by it. The yard had standing puddles that would take days to drain. And the smell of disturbed earth and wet timber was thick in the air. It wasn't a morning that invited optimism on its face. But the cattle were visible from the upper pasture fence, moving normally, grazing in the mild way they did when they weren't distressed. And the barns were dry inside, and the main dam structure was standing. She stood in the yard and took account of what she had. It was enough, more than enough. She found Wade at the dam around mid-morning, where he'd gone with Chet and Danny Reeves to look at the breach in the eastern section and start the assessment for repair. The three of them were standing at the base, looking up at it, and Wade was explaining something to Chet, pointing to the section above the breach. Chet was listening. Adeline had not seen Chet listen to another man the way he was listening then since the early days, when her father was still alive and running the operation. She stopped at the edge of the high ground and watched them for a moment. She thought about 12 years. She thought about a night in the snow that she remembered in pieces, the cold, the dark, the sound of a young man's breathing close beside her, the melody, the warmth of a coat that wasn't hers. She thought about what kind of man walks away from that and never mentions it. She thought about what kind of man you'd have to be to arrive at the door of the person whose life you'd saved, recognize her, and choose to let her judge you on nothing but what you showed her going forward. The answer that kept coming back to her was a man who believed that what you did in the past entitled you to nothing in the present. A man who had decided somewhere in his own private accounting that a debt owed was not a debt to collect. She didn't know how to carry that. She didn't know how to put it down either. She stood at the edge of the high ground in the morning after the flood, with the smell of wet earth around her, and the cattle moving in the upper pasture, and the barns standing dry below, and she looked at Wade Hollister explaining repair work to her foreman at the base of the dam. And she thought about all the things that were true about him that he hadn't told her. She thought, you're going to have to say something. Not today. But soon, she thought, he's going to have to answer for it. Thought, and whatever he says, I'm going to have to figure out what to do with it. The wind came off the mountains the way it always did, cool and without apology, and she stood in it and didn't move for a long moment. Then she walked back to the house. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And she had learned, over 12 years of doing it alone, that the work was what kept you honest when everything else felt uncertain. She kept that thought with her through the rest of the day, and it helped. Mostly, the dam repair took 11 days. Wade ran it. The way he ran everything methodically, without theater, pulling the right men for the right sections and working alongside them, so nobody felt like they were doing the hard part while someone else watched. The eastern breach required full repointing of the base joints, which meant draining the feed section first and working in the damp cold of exposed stone. And it was miserable work that the men did without complaint, mostly because Wade was doing it with them, and complaining in front of him felt somehow inappropriate. Chet managed the rest of the ranch operation during those 11 days. He did it without friction, which told Adeline that something had shifted between the two men after the flood. She didn't ask about it directly. Some adjustments happened best when you left them alone to settle. The southeast pasture was a loss for the season, as she'd known it would be. Standing water had receded, but left behind the compacted, silted ground that needed breaking up and reseeding before it would graze properly again. She put 2 hands on that work and filed the cost where it belonged under the heading of what you gave up to keep what mattered. 3 neighboring ranchers sent word in the week after the flood. Polite notes. The kind men in the valley wrote when they wanted to acknowledge something without making a fuss about it. 2 of them mentioned that Wade's diversion channel had kept the floodwater from reaching the lower sections of their own properties. They hadn't been in danger of serious loss, but the channel had given the water somewhere to go before it spread, and they noticed. One of them, Harlan Fitch, who ran a modest cattle operation 2 miles south and had always been cordial to Adeline without being particularly interested in Silver Briar's affairs, came in person. He was 60, weathered in the way of a man who'd spent his life outdoors and didn't mind it, and he sat in her kitchen and drank coffee and said what he'd come to say. That channel work saved me probably 30 acres of bottom ground, Harlan said. I want to know who figured it. My hand, Adeline said. Wade Hollister. Harlan turned his coffee cup in his hands. He been in the valley long? Since April. Harlan looked at her with the patient steadiness of a man who spent his days reading weather and livestock and had learned to read people the same way. Keeping him? Harlan asked. Yes, she said. He nodded slowly. Good, he said. Simple as that. After he left, Adeline sat at the table for a while. She thought about the notes from the other ranchers. She thought about Gideon, who had not sent a note and had not come back since their last conversation, which was its own kind of statement. She thought about the question she'd been carrying since the night in the stable. It was getting heavier. She waited until the dam repair was finished. She told herself that was practical. She didn't want to put anything in Wade's way during the work. But she knew, honestly, that she was also waiting because she didn't yet know how to begin. She'd started the conversation in her head a dozen times, and it came out differently every time, and none of the versions felt right. The repair finished on a Thursday. Wade did a final inspection, walked the full length of the dam with Chet, and came back to report that it was sound. Better than before, he said, because the new mortar work had addressed weaknesses in sections that hadn't failed yet, but would have. That evening, she found him at the corral after supper, running a check on the gate latch that had been giving trouble. He'd been meaning to fix it for 2 weeks and hadn't had time. Now he had time and he was using it, which was exactly the kind of man he was. She waited until he'd finished with the latch. Wade, she said. He turned. She said, come inside. There's something I need to talk to you about. He looked at her face, and whatever he read there made him go still for a moment, not alarmed. More like a man who has been waiting for a particular moment and has just recognized its arrival. All right, he said. They went to the kitchen. She put the lamp on the table, and they sat across from each other the way they had before, but different. The easy quiet of those earlier evenings was gone. The room felt held in, like weather before a change. She didn't start with the question. She started before it. 12 years ago, she said, I was 20 years old, and I was driving a wagon back from my uncle's place in Garfield County. It was November. The storm came in faster than anyone predicted, and I went into a ravine when the back wheels broke through a snow-covered washout. She kept her eyes on his face. The wagon went over. I was trapped under the front section. I don't remember most of it clearly. I remember cold. I remember darkness. I remember a man pulling me out. Wade sat across from her. He hadn't moved. His hands were flat on the table. She looked at his left hand. She reached across and turned it over so the palm faced up. Scar ran across the lower palm, pale and old, healed clean. Cut his hand on the wagon wreckage while he was pulling me out, she said. I was aware enough at one point to see the blood in the snow. I told him to wrap it, and he told me not to worry about him. She looked up from the scar to his face. He hummed to me to keep me awake, the same 4 bars over and over. I heard you humming that melody in the stable in April. The silence in the room was complete. Wade looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, yes, one word, no hesitation, no attempt to qualify it or explain it or soften it in any direction. Just yes. She had prepared herself for denial. She'd thought about it, the possibility that she was wrong, or that he'd tell her she was wrong, and she'd have to sit with her own certainty against his contradiction. She hadn't prepared as thoroughly for simple confirmation. She breathed. How long have you known? She asked. How long since you recognized me? When you walked across the yard that first morning, he said. When you told Chet to wait. She stared at him. That was the first day. Yes, you've known since the first day. Yes. She sat back in her chair. She needed a moment with that. The entire span of the past 2 months, everything that had happened, everything she'd been watching and calculating and wondering about, and he had known from the first morning. He had known when he dug out the irrigation channel. He had known when he'd sat across from her at this table with cold coffee between them. He had known when she'd wrapped his leg, when the flood came, when the dam broke. He'd known the entire time and said nothing. Why, she said. Just tell me why. He looked down at the scar on his palm for a moment, then back up. Because I came here asking for work, he said. Not for payment. There's a difference to you. There's a considerable difference to me, he said. She watched him. Walk me through it, she said. I want to understand how you thought about it. He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, more like a man who didn't talk about himself often and was finding the words for something he'd thought about, but never said aloud. I was 19, he said. I was riding back from my uncle's place up near Choteau, heading home because my family was leaving the territory in the morning. We'd been in Montana my whole life, and my father had decided it was time to go west. Oregon. We were gone by the next afternoon. He paused. I found your wagon in the ravine. I heard you. I got you out. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you'd describe work you'd done. I carried you to the line cabin about 2 miles north. I kept the fire going, and I waited until you were stable, and then I rode for help. By the time help came back, I was already gone. My family was waiting. You never came back, she said. I never expected to see you again, he said. You were alive. That was the point. She looked at his face. And then you showed up here in April. My situation had gotten difficult, he said. The understatement in it was immense, and he knew it, from the brief tightening at the corner of his mouth. I'd heard Silver Briar was hiring. I didn't know it was your ranch until I was at the gate. And then you saw me. And then I saw you, he said. And I had a choice to make in about 30 seconds. And you chose not to say anything. Yes, she leaned forward. Help me understand that choice, Wade. You're standing at my gate with Jamie. You've got nothing, and you recognize the woman who owes you her life. Why wouldn't you tell her? He met her eyes steadily. Because if I'd told you, everything after that would have been different, he said. Every job I did, you'd wonder if I did it out of competence, or because you felt obligated to keep me on. Every time you made a decision about my place here, there'd be a debt under it. He paused. I don't want to be somewhere I'm kept out of obligation. Jamie doesn't need that either. He needs something real. She stared at him. You could have used it, she said. You know that. A wealthy ranch owner, and you're holding a 12-year debt. Most men would have used that. I know, he said. But you didn't. No. She pushed back from the table and stood up. She needed to move. She went to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out at the dark yard. She thought about the months behind them, the fence work, the irrigation channel, the water line rerouting, the conversation about copper, the flood, 11 days at the dam base in the cold. She thought about every decision she'd made about keeping him on, extending his time, giving him more responsibility, and she understood now that every single one of those decisions had been made without the weight of that debt in it. He'd made sure of that. He'd engineered it, deliberately removing the debt from the equation before she even knew it was there. She turned back around. That was your plan, she said. From the first day. Let me judge you on what I see. Nothing else. He didn't look away. Yes, and if I'd sent you away in the first week, he considered this honestly, then I'd have gone, he said. I wasn't going to stay somewhere I didn't earn. She looked at him for a long moment. Do you know what I spent 12 years thinking about? She said. About that night? He waited. I thought about whether I'd imagined parts of it, she said. Whether the man was as young as I remembered, or whether that was the fever. I thought about whether he'd been scared. He hadn't seemed scared, but he was young and alone with a woman badly hurt in the middle of a snowstorm, and I always wondered whether I just couldn't tell, or whether he actually wasn't. She stopped. I thought about whether he knew what he did, whether he understood that he saved my life. Wade sat with that. Did you? She asked. Know what you were doing? I knew you would have died if I'd left you, he said. Whether that constitutes knowing what I was doing. He made a small movement with his hand that was the closest thing to a shrug she'd ever seen from him. I just did what was in front of me to do. She came back to the table. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the wood and looked at him directly. You saved my life twice, she said. Once in the snow, and once last week when the dam broke. The dam broke because the mortar gave out, he said. Not because of anything I weighed, she said. Don't. Stop. I'm telling you what's true, she said. Twice. And both times you walked away from it like it was just a job you'd done. He didn't answer that. She looked at his face. She looked at the scar on his hand on the table between them. She thought about all the things you carry alone and what it costs to carry them. And she thought about a 19-year-old boy riding through the snow back to a family that was leaving in the morning. And she thought about what it meant to do the right thing and have no one ever know you did it. Thank you, she said. 12 years late. But I mean it. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted not dramatically, not in the performed wave of someone accepting gratitude they'd been waiting for. More like a man who'd been holding something at arm's length for a long time and was deciding it was all right to set it down. You don't owe me anything, he said. No, she said. I know. That's not why I'm saying it. She didn't sleep much that night. Not because she was troubled by what she'd learned. She'd had 2 months of suspicion to absorb the shape of it, and the confirmation had brought a strange clarity rather than new weight. It was more that her mind wanted to keep turning the thing over, examining it from different positions the way you do with a stone you've picked up and found remarkable. She thought about character, about what it meant and how you measured it, and whether you could see it or only see what it produced. She'd met men who were honest when honesty cost nothing. She'd met men who were generous with what they had to spare. She'd met men who worked hard when they were being watched. None of that was particularly remarkable. Wade had been offered, effectively, a loaded hand. 12 years of legitimate claim on her gratitude, her sense of obligation, her conscience. He'd arrived at her gate at the lowest point of his life, with a child who needed a stable home and food on a regular basis, and he'd held that hand without playing a single card from it. That was not a small thing. She lay in the dark and thought about Jamie, about the book and the school books on her kitchen table and the boots by her door, about the way the boy had walked into this house and occupied it without drama, filling in silence that had been there so long she'd stopped hearing it. She thought about what it meant to keep a child moving from bunkhouse to bunkhouse, ranch to ranch, bad luck to bad luck, and still raise him to be the kind of kid who carried water buckets carefully and said thank you like he meant it, and noticed that a house was too big for one person. Whatever Wade had lost over the past several years, and it was considerable, he hadn't lost the thing that mattered most. She turned over and tried to sleep. The confrontation she hadn't anticipated came 4 days later in town. She'd gone to Millhaven for supplies and to settle accounts with the feed merchant, and she'd taken Wade with her because she wanted another set of eyes on the timber pricing for the dam reconstruction's final phase. They went on a Tuesday, which was a slow day in town, and the business was straightforward and went quickly. It was coming back through the main street that they encountered Gideon. He was coming out of the hotel with 2 men. She didn't know the kind of men you hired when you wanted someone to negotiate on your behalf, and you wanted the negotiation to feel like leverage. He saw them, and he didn't pretend he hadn't. He crossed the street. Adeline, he said, cordial. The practiced warmth that sat on him like a suit. He looked at Wade beside her. Hollister. Wade said nothing. He wasn't being rude about it. He just didn't fill silence that didn't need filling. I've been hearing things, Gideon said, about what happened at Silver Briar during the flood. Word gets around. He addressed this mostly to Adeline, but his attention kept returning to Wade the way a man's attention keeps returning to a problem he hasn't solved yet. Quite a decision, tearing up your own pasture on a theory. It wasn't a theory, Adeline said. It was an assessment. His assessment, Gideon said. He said it without heat, just identifying the fact. A man who's been in this valley less than 3 months made a call that risked a season's worth of grazing land, and you went with it. I did. And if he'd been wrong, he wasn't wrong. Gideon smiled the thin smile. Luck, he said. It was the wrong word. She knew it was the wrong word, and she suspected Gideon knew it too. But he said it anyway, and she understood that it was deliberate, said loudly enough for the 2 men behind him to hear, said on a public street where other people were passing. She felt Wade ghost still beside her. She was about to respond when Gideon shifted his attention fully to Wade. "Let me ask you something directly," Gideon said. He had the tone of a man who decided that civility had served its purpose and something more direct was warranted. "What exactly is your interest in Silver Briar Ranch? Because, from where I stand, a man with your history, 3 failed operations, no property, no roots shows up here with a sick kid and a good story. And within 2 months, he's making capital decisions, and the owner is defending his judgment in the middle of town." He paused. "That's either very fast competence or very good manipulation. I'm not sure which." The 2 men behind him had straightened slightly. Adeline started to speak. Wade put his hand briefly on her arm, not restraining, just indicating he wanted to answer this himself. She let him. He looked at Gideon steadily. No color in his face. No heat. "My interest in Silver Briar Ranch," Wade said, "is doing the job I was hired to do. Same as every other hand on the property." He paused. "My 3 previous operations failed because of drought and fire, which you know, and which has nothing to do with my competence. You know that, too." Another pause. "And my son isn't a prop in a story, Mr. Drake. He's a kid. Be careful how you talk about him." The last sentence was quiet, entirely quiet, and it landed differently than anything else he'd said. Because of that quiet, the particular quality of a man who doesn't raise his voice when he means something seriously. Gideon's expression tightened. "I'm talking about you," he said. "Not the boy. You mentioned him," Wade said. "I'm noting that." The silence on the street had taken on texture. 2 men nearby had stopped moving. A woman coming out of the dry goods store had paused. Gideon looked at Adeline. "You see what he does," he said. "He deflects. He reframes." "It's very Gideon," Adeline said. He stopped. She took a step forward. She wasn't a tall woman, but she had a way of filling her space when she decided to fill it that had nothing to do with height. "Wade Hollister has been at Silver Briar for 3 months, she said. "In that time he found a failing irrigation line that would have cost me the eastern pasture rotation. He rerouted a water feed that was going to fail before summer. He designed and executed an emergency diversion plan in 48 hours that kept my barn standing and my herd safe during the worst spring flood I've seen in 10 years. She kept her voice level. 3 neighboring ranchers sent me notes after the flood saying his channel work kept the water from reaching their low ground." She looked at Gideon. "That's not manipulation. That's what competent looks like. You've apparently forgotten what it looks like because nobody on your operation has shown you any in a while." 2 men behind Gideon had gone very quiet. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. His face had gone through several things and arrived at something flat and controlled. "You're going to regret this," he said. He meant the conversation. He possibly meant longer than that. "I'll let you know," she said. He walked away. His 2 men followed. The street returned to itself, gradually, the way public spaces do when an incident ends, people beginning to move again, the ordinary sounds reasserting themselves. Wade stood beside her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes, I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "He's going to make things difficult." "He already makes things difficult," she said. "That part isn't new." She looked up at him. He was watching Gideon walk away with the expression of a man tracking a problem and calculating its probable behavior going forward. "Come on," she said. "We need to finish at the lumber merchant before he closes." They drove back to Silver Briar in the late afternoon, the wagon loaded with what they'd come for, the mountains long and dark against the sky to the west. The road was still soft in places from the flood runoff, and Wade handled the team carefully through the low sections, which he knew without being told, the way he seemed to know most things about managing in difficult terrain. She sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the road. After a while, she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not politely." He glanced at her. "All right. When you were at that gate in April," she said, "when you saw me and recognized me and made your decision in 30 seconds, did you think about whether it was the right call? Or did you just make it?" He thought about it. The road came around a long curve, and he brought the team through it, and then thought some more. "Both," he said. "At the same time. Explain that." "I knew immediately that I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "That wasn't a decision so much as just knowing. And then I spent about 30 seconds making sure I could justify it." He looked at the road. "The justification was that I was there asking for something." not offering something. If I'd come to pay you back a visit, or to collect what was owed, that would have been different. But I was there because I needed work and Jamie needed a roof. Using your obligation to me to get those things. He shook his head slightly. That's not the kind of thing I want Jamie to see me do. She looked at him. Everything you've done, she said slowly, you've done because of what you want Jamie to see. He didn't answer immediately. Not everything, he said, after a moment, but a lot of it. She turned back to the road. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it meant to hold yourself to account because someone small was watching you. She thought about her own father, who had done the same thing, had run Silver Briar, with the specific intention of showing her how a thing should be done, so she'd know when she had to do it herself. She hadn't understood that until he was gone, and she was alone with the ranch, and found that she knew, somehow, exactly what to do. He'd put it in her, without her realizing. Wade was doing the same thing, not with land or money. With how he stood, and what he said, and what he refused to say, and what he refused to take that wasn't honestly earned. The ranch came into view as they rounded the last hill. The barns, the stable, the house with the lamp already lit in the kitchen window, which meant Jamie was in there doing his schoolwork, because that was what he did in the evenings. Wade, she said. Yeah, I want to offer you a permanent position, she said. Head foreman. The full role. I should have said it before now, and I didn't, and I'm saying it now. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the house. Don't tell me you need to think about it. Don't make it complicated. Yes or no. He drove the wagon through the ranch gate. Yes, he said. Good, she said. We'll discuss the terms tonight. He pulled the team to a stop at the stable. He set the brake. He sat for a moment with the reins in his hands before he climbed down. She climbed down from her side. She looked at him over the back of the nearest horse. One more thing, she said. He waited. I'm glad you found that wagon, she said. 12 years ago. I've thought about that night more times than I can count, and I never found the right way to say that. And I'm saying it now. He looked at her across the horse's back in the late afternoon light, with the lamp burning in her kitchen window behind them. He said, I'm glad too. It wasn't much. It was exactly enough. She went inside to where Jamie was sitting at her kitchen table with a schoolbook open and a pencil in his hand. And she sat down across from him, and she asked how the lesson was going. And he said it was going fine, except for the long division, which he thought was designed to be as difficult as possible on purpose. And she said she thought he might be right about that. And she got him a glass of water and sat with him while he worked. And the lamp was warm between them, and outside she could hear Wade settling the team for the night. The sound of it felt like something she'd been missing without knowing the name for it. She helped Jamie with the long division. She didn't think about anything else for the rest of the evening. The terms took longer to settle than either of them expected. Not because they disagreed on the substance, the salary, the responsibilities, the scope of the role. Those came together in one conversation at the kitchen table, with the ledger open between them and both of them, practical enough to get through the numbers without difficulty. What took longer was the other part, the part that wasn't salary. Wade didn't bring it up. She did. There's a foreman's cottage, she said. East side of the property, about 200 yards from the stable. My father built it for the first man who held the role. It's been empty for 4 years. Wade looked at her across the ledger. You and Jamie should be in it, she said. Not the stove room. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, the offer, what it meant, what it cost him to take it. Adeline, he said. Don't, she said. She'd learned to recognize when he was about to decline something on principle. It's not charity. It's part of the position. Every foreman I've had has lived on this property. It comes with the job. The stove room is fine, he said. The stove room is 12 feet square with a stove that works most of the time, she said. You told me that yourself the first week you were here. Jamie's 9 in June. He needs a room he can stand up in without hitting his head on the rafters. Wade looked at the table. She waited. The cottage needs work, he said finally. It wasn't a refusal. It was a condition. She recognized the difference. Then you'll do the work, she said. It's your cottage. Fix it how you want it. He looked up at her. Yes, he said. She closed the ledger. Done. She didn't examine how much satisfaction that gave her. She just went to bed. Jamie found out the next morning. Wade told him before breakfast, sitting on the edge of the cot in the stove room with the boy in front of him, and Adeline learned about the conversation secondhand from Tom Birch, who had been passing the open window and heard enough of it to report with the particular relish of a man who found human moments genuinely interesting. According to Tom, Wade had explained the situation plainly: new job, new place to live, a cottage on the east side. He'd said it was a real room for Jamie, with a window and space for his books and a proper bed. Jamie had listened to all of it. Then he'd said, "Are we staying?" And Wade had said, "Yes, we're staying." And Jamie had sat with that for a moment, really sat with it, the way children do when they're checking something important against everything they know about the world and whether the world is in the habit of keeping its promises. Then he'd said, "Okay," and gone to get his breakfast. Tom told Adeline this while leaning in her office doorway with his arms crossed and an expression of someone reporting something that deserved to be marked. "Okay," Tom repeated. That's all he said. 9 years of moving around, and that's all the boy said. Adeline looked at her desk. "Because he believed it," she said. Tom unfolded his arms. "Yes," he said. "I thought so too." He left. She sat at her desk for a while after that, without doing any of the work on it. Cottage work took 2 weeks. Wade did most of it himself, in the hours before the ranch day started and after it ended, with Danny Reeves helping on the weekends, because Danny was young and had energy left over at the end of the day, and had appointed himself generally useful to Wade in the way young men sometimes attach themselves to Anne. Older man whose company clarifies something for them. The cottage had good bones, as her father had built things solid and plain and intended to last. What it needed was repointing in 2 exterior walls, a new window sash on the north side, the interior replastered in the main room, and the kitchen end reorganized so it was actually functional rather than theoretical. Wade did these things steadily, and when he wasn't sure about the plaster work, he asked old Harris at the hardware in Millhaven, who had been replastering things for 40 years, and was happy to explain it to anyone who'd listen. Adeline walked past the cottage most mornings and evenings without stopping. She wasn't supervising. She was just aware of it. The way you're aware of something changing at the edge of your property, the sound of it, the activity around it, the gradual shift from empty to occupied. Jamie started putting things in it before it was finished. A small shelf appeared near the future bedroom window, a milk crate that he used as a secondary surface for his school books. He'd decided the room was his before the plaster was dry, and he was furnishing it in his mind and then in practice, and Wade watched this happen with an expression that Adeline caught once, from a distance, when neither of them knew she was looking. It was not an expression she had words for. It was the expression of a man watching something he'd been afraid to hope for become real. Gideon's move came in June, and it came the way his moves always came through other people first. Adeline heard it from Harlan Fitch, who came again on a Tuesday morning, and this time his expression was less comfortable than his previous visit. "There's talk going around," Harlan said. "About your man Hollister." She set her coffee down. "What kind of talk?" "The kind Gideon Strake manufactures when he wants someone discredited," Harlan said, with the directness of a man who'd been in the valley long enough to know what that looked like. "Story is that Hollister left the Halloran operation under bad circumstances. Theft, supposedly. Some equipment that went missing." Adeline kept her face still. "That's not true." "I know it's probably not true," Harlan said. "I'm telling you because it's going to reach more people than just me before the week is out, and you might want to be ready for it." She thanked him, and he left, and she sat at her desk for approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took her to decide what she was going to do about it. She went to find Wade. He was at the north fence with 2 of the hands. She waited until there was a natural break, and then she said, "I need to talk to you," and he handed off what he was doing and came with her to a spot away from the others. She told him what Harlan had said. He listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Halloran operation," he said. "I was there for 14 months. 2 horses went missing the winter before I left. They were found 3 weeks later in a ravine they'd broken through ice on a creek. Halloran knew it wasn't theft by the time I moved on. Can Halloran confirm that?" "Halloran died in March," Wade said. "Stroke." She looked at him. Who else was there who'd know? His foreman. Man named Greer. He looked at the fence line. "I don't know where Greer is now." She thought about it. Gideon's betting you can't produce a witness fast enough for it to matter, she said. He wants the story to spread through the valley before you can counter it. That's how he works. Wade looked at her. What do you want to do? It was the right question. He'd asked it not what are you going to do, not I'll handle it. He asked what she wanted, which told her he understood that this was her operation and her decision and he wasn't going to step in front of it. I'm going to handle it, she said. You focus on the work. Let me handle Gideon. He held her eyes for a moment. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do, she said. Because it's not just about you. He's doing this to weaken Silver Briar. You happen to be the current target. She turned back toward the house. He's been doing it for 3 years in different forms. I'm done letting him do it. She wrote 3 letters that afternoon. One to a rancher in Fergus County who had overlapped with the Halloran operation and whose name she knew from the Territorial Cattlemen's Association records. One to the association's own secretary, requesting the association's records on the Halloran property during the relevant period. And one to a lawyer in Billings she'd used twice before on property matters, who was thorough and fast and had no connection to Gideon Strake's circle. She sent all 3 with the same rider that afternoon, with a note that speed was the point. Then she went to the June cattlemen's meeting in Millhaven, which she had considered skipping and now decided was exactly where she needed to be. The meeting was held at the Millhaven Hall, which served as the closest thing the valley had to a civic gathering place. 14 ranchers, their foreman in some cases the association secretary. Gideon was there, which she had expected. He was there with the 2 men she'd seen him with on the main street after the flood, which she had also expected. She brought Wade. She hadn't told him she was bringing him until that morning. He'd looked at her with the expression that meant he was working out whether to argue about it. It's your reputation they're discussing, she said. You should be there. He'd come. The meeting proceeded through its ordinary business grazing schedules, water rights discussions, the assessment for repairing the shared North Road after the spring runoff. Adeline participated in the ordinary business the way she always did, completely and specifically, because she'd learned that the people who went to meetings and did their actual work during them were the ones who got listened to when they said something that mattered. Gideon waited until after the main agenda. He didn't bring up the story about the Halloran horses directly. He was too careful for that direct accusations had legal implications. Instead, he raised, in the general discussion period at the end, the question of vetting practices for new hires in the valley, and he talked about the importance of verifiable history, and he looked at Adeline twice while he said it. She waited until he was finished. Then she said, I want to address something that's been circulating this week. The room went attentive in the particular way of people who've heard enough to know something is coming. She didn't raise her voice. She stated the facts about the Halloran operation, the horses, the ravine, and what the actual finding had been. She stated them the way you state things you're prepared to document. She said Wade Hollister had been her head foreman for the past 3 weeks, that his work on Silver Briar had directly benefited 3 properties in this valley during the spring flood, that the men in this room had received notes from those property owners about it, and that the story going around was false and had a specific origin. She looked at Gideon when she said the last part. The room knew what she meant. Gideon smiled. I didn't say anything specific, he said. I raised a general point about. You raised it specifically enough, said Harlan Fitch from across the table. He said it without looking up from his hands, just a plain statement from a man who'd been in the valley 30 years and had apparently decided to spend some of that credibility. Gideon looked at Harlan. Harlan looked back at him with the comfortable steadiness of a man who didn't need anything from anyone in the room. The moment passed. The meeting ended shortly after. Outside on the hall steps, 2 of the other ranchers stopped to speak to Wade, not about the meeting specifically, just the ordinary talk of men in the same territory. Grazing conditions, the summer outlook, the dam repair. Conversation was easy. They addressed him the way you address someone you've decided is a legitimate part of things. Adeline watched it from a few feet away. She thought about the word Gideon had used months ago. Drifter. She thought about how thoroughly that word had failed to describe the man, standing on the hall steps talking about summer grazing with men who now considered his judgment worth hearing. She thought about how words like that did their damage fast and required a long time to undo, and how the undoing was always done by the same plain mechanism showing up, doing the work, letting the work speak until the words stopped meaning anything. Wade had been doing that since April. She walked down the steps. The summer settled into its rhythms. The southeast pasture was replanted. In late June, the broken ground turned over and seeded with the particular stubbornness of someone who's lost a thing and is determined to get it back. Wade supervised it, and Adeline contributed the stubbornness, and Tom Birch said it would come up fine by September if the rain cooperated, which in Montana was the best guarantee anyone could offer about anything. Jamie turned 9 in June. Adeline made a cake. She hadn't made a cake in years, there had been no occasion for one, and the result was imperfect in a structural sense, listing slightly to the left because of a miscalculation with the pan, but it tasted correct, and Jamie ate 2 pieces without mentioning the lean. He got a pocket knife from his father, which he accepted with the reverence appropriate to such an object, and a book from Adeline, a different one this time, longer, with more chapters. He looked at the cover and then looked at her. "Is this one better than the last one?" he asked. "Different," she said. "The ending is slower. You might like it better." He nodded, satisfied with this information, and went to put it on the shelf in his room. His room. In the cottage on the east side of the property, which smelled now of fresh plaster and the particular drywood smell of a place that has been closed up and opened again, and is still deciding what it wants to smell like permanently. She stood in the kitchen of the cottage after the birthday supper and washed the dishes, which Wade had protested and she had ignored, and she looked out the window at the summer evening, settling over the property, and she thought about a year. Less than a year ago, she had stood at the stable and watched 2 figures come up the road from the gate, one tall and one small. She thought about what you can't know from watching 2 figures come up a road. She thought about how much had fit itself into the space between that morning and this one. It was late July when she finally asked him the question she'd saved longest. They were at the south fence at the end of the day, checking the line before a weather system the mountains had been advertising for 2 days came down to make good on its promise. The light was long and amber, the way July light got in the evenings, and the grass was high and very green from the adequate June rain. And the ranch looked the way it occasionally looked when everything had come together correctly. Not perfect, never perfect, but right. Like something done the way it was supposed to be done. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You usually just ask," he said. "This one I'm asking permission for," she said. He looked at her. "That night," she said, "when you found my wagon, you were 19. You were heading home to your family. You were leaving the territory in the morning." She looked at the fence line. "You didn't know me. You had every reason to ride to the nearest town and send back help instead of staying." She paused. "Why did you stay? All night by yourself? Why didn't you just get help and go?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the mountains for a moment. The weather system was visible as a darkening along the ridge, still hours away. "Because you needed someone there," he said. "Not just help on its way. Someone actually there." She looked at him. "She was alone," he said. "You were alone in the dark. If I'd ridden off, even to get help, you'd have been alone with that." He shook his head slightly. "I couldn't do that. I don't know how else to explain it." She stood with that for a moment. "There's nothing else to explain," she said. He looked at her. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole answer." She turned back to the fence. "Some people have it, and some people don't. The thing where someone else's situation in front of you is enough. You don't need more reason than that." He was quiet. "Is that why you stayed?" he asked. "At Silver Briar all these years. Running it alone." She thought about it honestly. "Partly," she said. "And partly because my father built it, and I wasn't going to let it go." She looked at the grass, the mountains, the sky going amber and dark at the same time. "Partly because I didn't know what else to do with myself. And for a long time, I thought that was enough reason. And now," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, patient attention he gave everything he was genuinely interested in. No performance. Just looking. "Now I think there are better reasons," she said. He held her gaze. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then the weather system sent a first wind down off the ridge, cool and definite, and they both turned to it automatically. And the moment moved on the way moments do, and they finished checking the fence line and walked back to the ranch in the long evening light without saying anything more about it. But the thing that had been unnamed between them had shifted again, closer to a name, and they both knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. Gideon made one final attempt in August. He came formally with his lawyer, and he sat in her office and presented a new version of the merger offer that was demonstrably better than the previous ones, and that he clearly believed represented his best case. She read it. She read it completely and carefully, the way she read everything, because she didn't decline things without understanding them. Then she set it on her desk. No, she said. His lawyer shifted in his chair. Gideon looked at her with the expression of a man who has run out of variations on a strategy and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. I'd like to understand your reasoning, he said. He was still calm. She gave him that. Silver Briar doesn't need what you're offering, she said. It didn't 3 years ago, and it doesn't now. I have a full crew, a functioning operation, repaired infrastructure, and a head foreman who knows this land as well as anyone working it in the valley. She folded her hands on the desk. Merging with Diamond Cross would give me capital I don't need at the cost of control I'm not willing to give up. That's been the answer for 3 years. It's still the answer. He looked at her for a long moment. Hollister, he said. Not as a question. Among other things, she said. He stood up. His lawyer stood up. He picked up the offer from her desk and held it for a moment, and she thought he might say something sharp, something that would require a response, and she was prepared for it. He didn't. He put the offer in his case. You're a stubborn woman, he said. It wasn't quite an insult and wasn't quite a compliment. I know, she said. He left. She sat at her desk and listened to his buckboard leave the yard, and she thought, that's done then. He'd come back eventually with something new, because men like Gideon always did, but the immediate campaign was over, and she'd held the ground, and the ground was still hers. She thought about what it had cost her to hold it. She thought, not as much as it used to. In September, the southeast pasture came up. Tom had said it would, and he was right, which was the thing about Tom. He was right often enough, that when he said something would happen, you did yourself the service of believing it. The grass was thin compared to what it would be next year, and sparse in the lowest section where the flood deposit had been thickest, but it was growing and the grade was good, and by next summer it would be working land again. Wade walked it with her one afternoon, and they looked at it together, both of them accounting for what had been given up and what had been preserved, the particular arithmetic of decisions made under pressure that you only get to evaluate after the season turns. It'll be fine, he said. I know, she said. They stood in the recovering pasture, and she thought about the flood and the dam and the 48 hours between his assessment and the water coming down the mountain, and she thought about what it was to trust someone's judgment when you couldn't verify it yet. She thought about how many times over the past 5 months she had made exactly that choice, and how many times it had been right. She thought about the kind of trust that got built not by grand declarations, but by accumulated evidence. The fence, the channel, the irrigation line, the dam, flood, the cottage, the birthday cake that listed left, Jamie's shelf of books, the evening at the south fence when she'd asked him why he stayed and he'd said, simply because you needed someone there. That was how it was built, one thing at a time. No single moment you could point to. Wade, she said. He looked at her. She'd been turning toward this for months. She understood now, not dramatically, not suddenly, but the way you turn toward something you've been walking parallel to for so long that eventually the angle just closes. I don't want to be the person you work for, she said. She stopped. She started over. This isn't a speech. I'm not good at speeches. I know, he said. You don't have to make one. She looked at him. Tell me what you want, she said. Not what's practical or what makes sense or what's appropriate for your position on this ranch. Tell me what you actually want. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the recovering pasture, the mountains, the sky, and then he looked at her, and he said, I want to stop wondering where Jamie sleeps next. I want to be somewhere for longer than the weather holds. He stopped. He started again, more careful. I want to come home to the same place every night and know it's going to be there in the morning. This is that place, she said. It can be that place. If you want it to be. He looked at her for a long time. I'm asking you plainly, she said, because I've watched you not ask for things for 5 months and I'm done waiting for you to ask. He said, yes, I want that. It was not poetry. It was not the kind of thing you'd put in a letter. It was exactly what it was, two people in a recovered pasture at the end of a hard year, saying yes to something true. She nodded. He reached across and took her hand, the right one, briefly, just enough to make the thing real. Then he let go, because they were standing in an open field, and there was still work to do, and they were both, fundamentally, practical people. They walked back to the ranch. They married in October, when the leaves had turned and the light on the mountains was the particular cold gold of fall. Tom Birch stood beside Wade. Jamie stood on Wade's other side, in a shirt that was too formal for him, and that he was tolerating with the stoic patience of a boy who understood that some occasions required the shirt. Harlan Fitch came. Several of the other Valley ranchers came. Chet came, and he shook Wade's hand afterward with the two-handed grip of a man, making a statement that didn't require words. Gideon did not come, which surprised no one. Jamie watched the ceremony with the serious attention he gave things he was trying to understand completely. Afterward, he stood beside Adeline, while the adults talked around them, and he looked up at her and said, with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old who has decided something important, "Are you my mother now?" She looked at him. She thought about how to answer that honestly, without making it too large or too small. "What do you think?" she said. He considered it. "I think you've been acting like it for a while," he said. "I was just checking if it was official." She looked at his face, serious and young, and watching her with those careful eyes that had been calculating whether the world was trustworthy since before she'd ever met him. "It's official," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went to find the cake. Silver Briar went on. The southeast pasture was full the following summer, thick and working, as if the flood had never touched it. The dam stood sound through 2 more harsh winters, the repaired section stronger than what they'd replaced. The water line that Wade had rerouted in April of his first year ran clean and reliable through 4 seasons and counting. Wade ran the foreman operation the way he ran everything, without theater, with complete competence, with the particular authority that doesn't require volume to be heard. The hands followed him because he'd earned it, which was the only kind of following that held through the hard days. Jamie grew. He stopped carrying water buckets that were too heavy for him, because he grew into them, and then past them, and by the time he was 12, he was taller than 2 of the regular hands, and could work a full day in the field, which he did without complaint, and with a focus that was, everyone agreed, entirely his father's. He kept the shelf of books in his room. He added to it every season. Adeline kept track of what he'd read and found him the next thing, and the conversation between them about books was its own ongoing thread through the year's quiet, specific, the kind of exchange that accumulates into something that doesn't have a name but doesn't need one. There were hard years. There were years when the cattle prices fell and they ran the ledger tight for months and ate simpler food and postponed things that needed postponing. There was a winter when 3 of the older hands got sick at the same time, and Wade and Adeline and Jamie ran the core operation between them for 2 weeks until the men recovered, and all 3 of them came out of it, exhausted and short-tempered, and more clear-eyed than before about what they were capable of. There were good years. There were summers when everything came right, and the pastures were full, and the numbers at the season's end were better than planned, and Adeline would sit at the kitchen table in the evening, with the ledger closed and a cup of coffee, and feel the particular satisfaction of a thing gone right that you worked hard enough for that it didn't feel like luck. Gideon sold the Diamond Cross in 1892 to a timber operation from back east and left the valley. Adeline heard about it from Harlan and felt almost nothing except a faint curiosity about what became of a man who'd spent years reaching for something that never became his. She supposed there was a lesson in that, but she'd already lived the lesson from the other side and didn't need to examine Gideon's version of it in detail. What she thought about instead, sometimes, in the quiet of the evenings when the ranch was settled and the lamp was low and Wade was reading at the other end of the table and Jamie was older now, and asleep in the room down the hall, what she thought about was the morning he'd arrived at her gate. not the rescue in the snow, which was its own memory, preserved and significant. The gate. The morning he'd walked up the road with almost nothing and asked for the hardest job she had. She thought about what it took to be that kind of person, to have your back against something and still not reach for what you hadn't earned. Carry a 12-year-old secret and lay it down the only way that kept your dignity by not using it. She'd spent her adult life running a ranch on her own, and she'd developed opinions about people that were not overly romantic. She knew that most people, put where Wade had been put, would have said something, would have found a way to mention it, gently, carefully, but mentioned it. She didn't blame those people. It was human. It was understandable. But Wade hadn't done it, and that fact sat in her life like a lodestone, something she came back to when she needed to remember what she believed about what people were capable of on their best days, when nobody was watching and they had every reason to do otherwise. He came because his son needed something real, and he stayed because he earned the right to stay, and the 12-year debt between them was never the point. It was never the mechanism. The mechanism was simpler and older and less convenient than debt. He was a man who helped because someone needed help, and that was the whole of it. And everything else had grown up around that simple fact, like a ranch around a reliable water source. She thought about what she would have said if you'd told her that April morning that the ragged cowboy at her gate had been carrying her life around in his pocket for 12 years without spending it. She would have said she didn't believe it. She would have been wrong. There was a version of this story she knew where she'd sent them down the road at the gate, where Chet's instinct had been the one that prevailed, where two figures had turned and walked back out the way they came, and the debt between her and a stranger in the snow had stayed unpaid in both directions until it simply dissolved in time. She thought about that version occasionally. She thought about it, and she felt the particular gratitude that has nothing to do with what you deserve and everything to do with what you were given. And she understood that some debts aren't meant to be paid. Some things you carry between people aren't debts at all. They're just what happened. What one person did for another when nobody was watching, and what the years made of it afterward. The lamp burned low. Wade looked up from his reading and looked at her across the table. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at him. "The gate," she said. That morning. He set his book down. He looked at her with the direct quiet that was still, after all these years, the thing she trusted most in a human face. "So am I," he said. "Sometimes." "What do you think about?" she asked. "When you think about it." He considered it honestly. He didn't rush the answer because he wasn't a man who rushed answers. "I think about Jamie standing beside me," he said. "How cold he was. And how you looked at him first." She remembered that. She had looked at the boy first. "And then," she said, "and then I think that was the right gate," he said. "That was the right road to come down." He paused. The rest of it, everything, before it was just how we got there. She looked at him across the lamp. She thought, yes, that's exactly right. All of it, the snow, the ravine, 12 years of a name she didn't know, the scar, the melody, the flood, the pasture, the cottage, the birthday cake, the shelf of books, all of it was just how they got there. Table, this light, this life. "Yes," she said. Outside, Silver Briar was quiet in the dark. The horses settled. The cattle on the north pasture, the good solid sound of a working ranch at rest. The mountains were out there, the same ones they'd always been, holding the snow that would come down in spring and the water that would run through the repaired dam and the restored pasture and the valley below. It was enough. It was, she thought, everything.